Welcome, everyone, to another installment of the Catholics Awaken podcast. My name is Tony Forrest, and I'm here with my best friend, Deacon-to-be Ken Steponaitis. Hi, Ken. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Good. So what'd you think of the music?
I like the music. We're evolving. We're getting better at this, huh?
Yeah, we are. And, maybe we'll have a professional studio over time or something. Who knows?
Bishop Barron, watch out. Here we go.
I don't think we'll ever catch up to that.
No, I don't think we ever will. But maybe one day we'll be able to sit around a table, you and I, face to face, and actually, have a podcast as opposed to, having to be separated because of the coronavirus.
Yeah, with those big old golden microphone hanging from the ceiling or something.
Exactly. So I hope that our topics are getting also more interesting, and that we're getting better at providing information to the folks. So folks, don't be shy. Leave comments on the website and let us know how we're doing. And if you have a topic that it's of interest to you, leave us a comment and let us know, and we'll research it and debate it and talk about it here at the Catholics Awaken podcast.
Sounds good.
So today we have a very interesting topic. It can be very controversial, and that is the topic of annulments, the annulment of a marriage. And I think that this is one of those topics that everybody is so misinformed. I know that I was so misinformed until I started researching a little bit about it, and everything that I thought I knew about it turned out to be wrong. So I'm excited about learning more about it. But like everything, before we talk about the annulment in this case, we have to start at the beginning. We have to talk about marriage. Mm-hmm. Ken, when does a Catholic Church tell us that marriage actually began?
Well, I mean, if you go to the Catechism, it refers right back to the book of Genesis, right back to the creation of Adam and Eve, man and woman. And that when God made man and woman, there's a part in Genesis where it says that the man leaves his mother and then cleaves to his wife, and the two shall become one, right? So that's all in the book of Genesis.
And we know the importance of marriage because we look at the life of Jesus, and when did Jesus start his ministry? At the wedding at Cana.
Miracle at Cana, what they call a sign in the book of John. There's 7 signs in the book of John, but that first sign that was given took place at a wedding, which shows that there must have been a significance to marriage for Jesus. Right. The fact that it took place at a wedding. I mean, he could have made water into wine at any old party, but he chose a wedding party. So, but also it refers back to what we talked about last time, that the relationship between Jesus and the church is much like a marriage, that there's an intimate relationship between Jesus and the church. And so the story of the miracle at Cana kind of reflects that.
And this also goes back to our conversation on the last podcast, when we were talking about the place of women in the church today. And we look at Jesus starting his ministry, and who said, "Go"?
Yeah.
But his mother, the Virgin Mary.
Exactly.
So we owe the Virgin Mary thanks for starting Jesus's ministry on that day.
At least in the Gospel of John, it's different in the other Gospels. But that's okay.
Exactly. Yeah. It's okay. Okay. So now that we understand a little bit more about the history of the marriage itself, what needs to happen for the church to consider that a marriage is actually legal? Because there's a difference between a civil marriage and a marriage according to the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a bit of a misnomer there too, because I'm going to give you an example. If somebody comes to the Catholic Church who is already married, and they had no affiliation with the Catholic Church at all, but they were married legally from their perspective at the time that they were married, the church sees that marriage as a valid marriage, a sacramental marriage, in fact. Another interesting point here is that if somebody comes to the Catholic Church already married and hasn't even been baptized, the marriage itself isn't sacramentalized until they are baptized. In fact, at the moment they are baptized, if they are already married, that marriage
Wow.
becomes sacramental, which is another interesting theological
Right.
statement of the church. So, so there's, the church isn't saying that in order to be validly married, you have to be married in the Catholic Church unless you are Catholic,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
So
Okay.
if you are Catholic, now the ecclesial law, the church law takes place, comes into effect. So in order for somebody to be legally married in the church, first, it has to be a man and a woman. That's
Right.
part of it. Secondly, they have to be married in a church, or they can also ask the bishop for a dispensation. Maybe they have a place outside of a church, particularly that they want to get married in, and they want that to take place outside of a Catholic church. Then they have to get permission from the bishop in order to have that marriage
Hmm.
performed. And then the other thing that has to happen is that there has to be a ordained minister
Right.
witnessing the marriage. Here's another interesting thing. A lot of people think that it's the priest or the deacon that confer the sacrament of marriage, and that's not the case. The case
No.
is that the man and the woman themselves confer that sacrament.
I
So
see.
the marriage is conferred by the husband and wife, and then it is witnessed by the
I see.
minister, the deacon or the priest.
And the man and the woman that will become husband and wife also have to have the intention of being married forever, right? That
Yes,
intention has to be there
yes.
to make it sacramental.
Yeah, they have to understand all that, which brings up another thing, that in order to be married in the Catholic Church, you have to go through some kind of a formation.
Right.
And so there's pre-marriage preparation for anybody who wants to get married in the Catholic Church. And usually that's something around a 6-month process that you have to go through. And depending on the diocese and the church that you're at will depend on the requirements for that diocese or church before you get married.
Yeah.
And that's really important when we start to talk about annulments, which we'll get to.
Yeah. It's interesting. Stella and I, when we got married, I was living in Dallas. She was living in George West, and the closest bigger town for us to get married at, for my family to be able to fly in for the wedding and everything, was San Antonio.
Yeah,
So we both had to get permission to marry outside of our parish.
that's
And
exactly right.
not only did we not marry in a parish, but we wanted to marry at the Incarnate Word Chapel
Uh-huh.
and in there. So we had to get permission for all of that. And
Yeah,
but everybody was very helpful. It was no problem at all.
that's great. Yeah, good deal.
So but also we have to remember that there's a total separation between a civil wedding and a Catholic wedding, if you will. In other countries, it's not like here in the U.S. where everything happens at the same time.
Yeah, here in the United States, the government yields to the churches and says that if you do have a wedding or marriage in the church, then that is an officially or legally binding marriage. Whereas if you go down to Mexico, for example, you've got to get married civilly first or
Yeah.
secondly, but somehow or another, there has to be a civil marriage that takes place outside of the church, because the government doesn't recognize the church as being a valid place to be married. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Go ahead.
the other thing is that the church doesn't see the marriage as having been sacramental unless it's done in the church. So there's
Yes.
legalities on both sides.
And as you know, my family, I was born in Cuba. So my parents experienced that when they were married. They were married by the civil law. They had a civil wedding 10 days before their Catholic wedding. And
Right.
I remember the story of after the civil wedding, my dad coming to my grandma, my mother's mom, and says, "Well, Maria Antonia, Elena and I are leaving. We'll see you in a few days." all in jest, and grandma
Right.
say, no,
No,
no, no,
that's right.
you're not married yet. So,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
okay. Um, so, so now let's try to understand a little bit about the annulment
Okay.
and what it is and what it isn't, and what does it signify to have an annulment. It
All
is,
right.
are there, I don't know if you can say a checklist, but are there specific reasons under which the church would provide or agree to annulments
Yeah.
in some cases and not in others?
Yeah. And before we get to that, I think it's
Okay.
really important that we understand that for the Catholic Church, when when a couple gets married in the Catholic Church, that this marriage is not a marriage of their own doing exclusively. In other words,
Right.
just because the husband and wife decide to get married isn't enough. There's more to it than that. For example, as you mentioned, the husband and wife to be have to understand that this marriage is to take place for the remainder of their lives. They're married
Right.
until death, right?
Yes.
And then in addition to that, they have to understand that that marriage wasn't just them deciding to come together, but that they were brought together by God, and
Okay.
that God brought them together. And what God has brought together, no man can separate, which is part of what's going on in the marriage. When the priest
Right.
makes some statements, one of the statements he makes is that, okay, you guys just got married, and this marriage, yes, you came together, you cooperated with God, but God brought you together, and you
Hmm.
cannot separate this. This is something that God has put together. Okay.
I see.
And as part of that process of learning about what matrimony is about in the church, that's one of the emphasis that's placed on that teaching, that this couple has to understand, one, this is until death do they part, and two, that this marriage came together because of God. Yes, you cooperated in it, but it's because of God, and you cannot separate it. Divorce does not separate a church marriage.
And in reality, isn't a couple that isn't that idea of divorce for breaking a marriage something that it's more than just frowning on? Is it a mortal sin, or how does the church view a divorce that it's intended to break a marriage?
Well, first of all, divorce in and of itself is not necessarily something that the church deals with. Divorce is considered to be a civil matter, not a
Okay.
church matter. So, for example, if a couple decides that for whatever reasons they can't live together,
Hmm.
and that at least from a legal perspective, from the state perspective, they want to separate, and they want to separate their households and taxes and all that stuff. The church doesn't say that there's necessarily a particular problem with that separation. Now, there may be sin within that relationship that needs to be rectified.
Right.
But the divorce itself, the church doesn't see it as a separation of the marriage or a breaking of the marriage covenant. No, the marriage still exists. As a matter of fact, if two people get divorced, they can still receive communion. If there was sin involved in that separation, then they need to go to reconciliation.
Right.
But after they've gone to reconciliation and they've reconciled that sin within that marriage, even if they're separated and divorced legally, they can still receive communion so long as they don't enter into another marriage with somebody
Right.
else, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's not the divorce that's the issue. It's how the husband and wife are now relating to each other. There may be sin in that relationship, but the divorce itself does not constitute a sin.
I see. Okay. That makes sense. So in terms of the annulment and what the church sees for annulment, are there guidelines of certain things that have to be met
Yeah,
for the church to consider the possibility of giving an annulment?
yeah. In fact, I have a document I have brought up here, and there's, I don't know, there's 2 pages and a little bit more of it's a list of things that constitute an invalid marriage. Okay.
Okay.
So I'll just give you an example of
Wait,
one.
before
Okay.
you go there, because you brought a very interesting term here.
Yeah.
You're not declaring, you're not granting a quote unquote divorce. You're just basically saying that the marriage, as it was originally intended, is invalid because of these circumstances.
That's right. So, all right. The marriage, first of all, an annulment does not make the marriage annulled.
Okay.
Because from the church's perspective, if the marriage is annulled, it was never valid, which means it was never really a marriage in the church.
Okay.
In other words, it was never a sacrament. Okay. It doesn't mean they weren't married civilly or otherwise. It doesn't mean that.
Right.
It means that there was something within the marriage that caused that marriage to be, for lack of a better way of putting this, non-sacramental. In other words, a marriage that wasn't brought together by God, but it was brought together by the two of them. They
Okay.
they didn't come together because of God's will. They came together because of their own will. And I'll give you an example of this. In our society today, this is something that Bishop Barron was talking about actually in one of his podcasts. He was saying that in our society today, one of the problems we have with marriage is that people enter into a marriage to satisfy their own desires, their own
Right.
personal desires, that it's not something that people enter into in order to satisfy what the church sees as a valid marriage. In other words, a valid marriage for the church is that it is unitive, that the two become one,
Right.
and that it's procreative, that when we enter into this marriage, that we're open to having children, to procreating. Well, there's marriages that are done today, and I'm not saying necessarily Catholic marriage, but any marriage, that people enter into the marriage because I just love this woman, or I just love this man, and we just want to be together. We want to live together. You know, well, what about children? No, we're not concerned about the children part of it. We're only concerned about being together. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the Catholic Church doesn't see it that way. The way the Catholic Church sees it is that this marriage is brought together for two purposes, unitive and procreative. And if those two things aren't in the minds and the wills of the people that are entering into that marriage covenant, that can constitute a marriage that isn't valid.
I
Does that
see.
make sense?
It does, but I think that marriages break up for a lot of other reasons that are not because of not being unitive or not being
Procreative.
procreative. So you have a couple that they've been married 20 years, have been together 20 years, and for whatever, as we get older, we get cranky, and maybe we're very hard to live with,
Yeah.
and they decide to part ways because they're doing a lot more fighting than working together, and maybe they've gone through therapy and tried all of these things. It doesn't mean that they didn't walk in with the idea that they were going to be married forever, and
That's
maybe
exactly
they had
right.
children and all those things. So I have a hard time understanding how can the church say that in that instance, for example, that maybe that was not a sacramental marriage because something was missing from the beginning.
Right. And there's a lot of reasons why. There's a lot of things that could cause something to be missing to make that marriage invalid. And like I say, I have a document here that lists, 2
Yeah.
and a little bit more pages of possible reasons why a marriage could be considered an invalid marriage. Notice here I'm saying invalid marriage because what an annulment does is it looks at the marriage and determines whether or not there's something in that marriage that made it invalid, sacramentally speaking. Okay. Now, what I was talking about in terms of a marriage being procreative and unitive, and whether two people enter into that marriage with that mindset. Two people could enter into that marriage with that mindset, and at least in that moment believe that they're entering into this marriage with all good intention. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But there may have been something in the marriage that wasn't exposed prior to marriage that constituted an invalid marriage. Okay. So let's
Okay.
look at, I'm just going to pull one off this sheet. Okay.
but I'm dying to hear one, you know.
Okay, so a grave lack of discretionary judgment concerning essential matrimonial rights and duties. You or your spouse was affected by some serious circumstances or factors that made you unable to judge or evaluate either the decision to marry or the ability to create a true marital relationship. So I'll give you a good example of something that might happen where they enter into the marriage with full intent of being unitive and procreative, but when they entered into the marriage, something wasn't exposed.
Okay.
Finances would be a prime example of this. Okay.
Okay.
So one of the things in marriage prep I know that they talk about is how you might handle your finances once you enter into a marital relationship. Okay. Well, what if this couple enters into this marital relationship and the guy is thinking to himself, you know what, I really want to marry this woman, and I'm going to say anything I need to say in order for this marriage to work, in order for this marriage to go forward. Right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but that is, I understand that one. That's very clear that he was deceitful from the beginning.
But that's one reason why a marriage
Yeah.
could be considered an invalid marriage. Let me just pick another
Yeah.
one. Let's see if we can come up with another one. Okay. Lack of new consent during no, that's a convalidation. Error regarding marital sacramental dignity and determine the will. Okay. You and or your spouse married believing that the marriage is not a religious or sacred relationship, but merely a civil contract or arrangement. Okay. Again, it gets back to, does the person in his heart of heart really believe that this is a sacramental engagement? Is the person going through all the motions and even at the time thinking, you know what, I'll come to believe it. I really love this woman. I think this is all going to work out, and I want to do what's right, and so I'm going to go through this. But 5 years into it, he's thinking, I don't even believe in the church. I don't believe in God. And then they decide that this whole relationship wasn't necessarily based on anything other than a fallacy. That this guy said he was, he believed in God, but the reality is in his heart of hearts, he probably didn't, even though his intention was to. Okay. If they can bring evidence before a tribunal about that, then that particular item in canon law could constitute an invalid marriage, even if they did all the right things.
Yeah. I can see that maybe there's something deep inside that someone didn't know, or that surfaces after years of marriage.
And I don't think it's even,
that may
it's not
cause
even
that, but I just have a hard time, looking. I know so many good people that I know that after 20 years of marriage, 25 years of marriage, then things break apart, and they had a wonderful 20 years, 25 years where they cared and loved and had children and went to church, and you look at them and you go, wow, they did all the right things, and suddenly something happens and they grow apart and they divorce, and I just have a hard time believing that for 20 or 25 years, the requirements, if you will, the fulfillment of everything that would make this a valid marriage was really not there, because there was something underlying that that made it not a sacramental marriage. Not really, it's like, yeah, you're married, but not really, because there was a little something there.
But Tony,
you
it's
know
not an issue. Look, the annulment process is to determine that. It is
yeah,
possible that somebody goes forward with this annulment process, and on
yeah,
the other end of it, they don't declare that the marriage was invalid. That they
yeah,
do declare that it was very valid, and that these people are getting divorced or separating or whatever, and trying to be remarried
yeah.
in the eyes of the church. Uh,
Henry VIII.
well, yeah, there's an example. Okay, so we can't say that every
Yeah,
person or every couple that decides to get an annulment is going to be granted an invalid marriage
yeah,
decree. So we can't say that. But I will tell you, if you go through this list, and I could go through every one of them, but you could see that in this list, there's a lot of areas where people could, with all good intention, have the right motivation for the marriage, but in the end don't really have it. Because
okay,
there's a lot of times where we believe we're doing the right thing, we're thinking the right thing, but in the end we weren't.
I see.
And so the church determines that. So with an annulment, what the church is going to do is the church is going to say, okay, if you believe that this marriage was invalid, then bring forth all the evidence that shows that. And
Yeah,
that's what an annulment does. You take and you put together all this information that is considered evidence to show that this marriage was an invalid marriage. It goes
hmm,
before a tribunal, which is like a court. The tribunal looks at that evidence and determines whether or not there was something in this marriage that caused the marriage to be an invalid marriage.
right.
And it's
Okay,
not foolproof, by the way.
yeah.
This is the best that the church can do, but it's not necessarily foolproof.
And what does that mean to the status of the children within that marriage? They're still,
They're
nothing
valid.
has changed,
No,
right?
not at all. As a matter of
You
fact,
know?
again, an annulment doesn't determine that the marriage never took place. That's not what an annulment is. An
Okay,
annulment says that the marriage is not, for lack of a better way of looking at this, sacramental, made
okay.
in heaven, if you will. Okay.
I see.
So if the marriage is not made in heaven, in other words, it wasn't God's will that this marriage come together, the ways that we can prove it, the ways that we can show that, is to look at the intention of the individual and then the follow through that came after that. The intention might have been good, but the follow through was not good. Therefore, the marriage was invalid.
I think that's important to stress as one more time, that the church is not saying that the marriage didn't happen.
Right.
The marriage was there. It just didn't rise to the level of sacramental because there was something in there that ultimately surfaced that caused the marriage to break up.
Yeah.
And because of that, it was not sacramental.
Right. And
Okay.
some people see this as a semantic issue. In other words, okay, well, you can call it an annulment if you want to, but I still see it as a divorce in the church.
Yeah.
But that's not the intention of annulment.
Yeah.
The intention of the annulment is to determine whether or not this marital relationship was in fact a unitive marital relationship made in heaven by God, and
Yeah.
it wasn't just a I'm going to use this term. It's not really what I mean, but a selfish act between two people that just
Right.
wanted to get
Yeah, yeah,
together.
yeah. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
It's not that they were mean, selfish people, but they were not
right.
looking at the big picture, if you will.
Yeah, and maybe
You
they
know.
didn't even understand the big picture,
Yeah. Okay.
which also can constitute invalidity in a marriage, by the way. Which is
So
why it's so important that the church requires that when two people decide to get married, they have to go through pre-marriage preparation.
yeah, and it is a step that people should not take lightly.
That's right.
In terms of that, and I tell it to my kids all the time: is you have to accept and love the other person that you're marrying, and realize that you're going to spend the rest of your life with that individual. So if there are things that you can't live with, don't think that you can change that other person, because it just doesn't work. So, and you
Yeah.
know Stella is living with the consequences of marrying me. So
I feel the same way about mine. What? Why did you marry me again?
Yeah, exactly.
Built up my ego here.
Oh, I want to ask you one more thing. It's probably a little bit off topic here. So this whole idea of till death to us part.
Yeah.
What happens when we go to heaven that a marriage is not, it's only till death to us part as opposed to forever and ever in eternity,
So if one of the primary purposes of marriage is procreative, well, that's not going to happen after our death, right? And so the whole purpose of marriage then is sort of dissipated in the death. So when we enter into heaven also, we enter into the most intimate of relationships with God, which is very much like a marriage in a way. Not a marriage between a man and a woman for procreative reasons, but nevertheless, still that same bonding, intimate relationship that brings us together as one. When we enter into heaven, we become very unitive with everyone that is a saint and God in heaven. We become one with God in heaven. And so there's no need for a marital relationship because in essence, we're all married to each other. So that's one way to look at it.
And that's a concept that when I first heard about it, in all honesty, it scared the heck out of me. It really did. It really did. It really did, because the idea of, as much as I love my wife, the idea of going to heaven and not being a couple, if you will, not, I guess I have this naive idea that we got to have it. Oh yeah, okay, we're there in heaven together as husband and wife till eternity. Loving each other and praising God. But I guess the love and the unity for God is so big that it supersedes, anything that we may feel for each other.
That's a great way to look at it, because what we're talking about here, when we enter into heaven, we're entering into a relationship that so far surpasses any love relationship that we have here on earth, that even marriage, it pales. I mean, earthly marriage pales in comparison to heavenly marriage with God.
So Stella asked me the other day, she says, well, what is your idea of heaven? And I think she was hoping for a deep answer, but she knew who she was asking. And I said, so my idea of marriage is all my favorite rock and roll bands from the 80s are playing. The music is really loud, and you're there with me, and you're actually enjoying the concerts, So that's my idea of heaven. So.
Unlike that Liberty concert. Did you go to the Liberty concert in New Orleans with me?
Yes, where Hall & Oates were playing.
Yes, and it was so so loud that we had to put tissues in our eyes. That was not heaven.
That. No, that was not heaven. That was not heaven. Okay. I think that we've wasted another good 30 minutes, No, we did really good. One way. We didn't waste it. We enjoyed it. Hopefully the listeners, don't feel that they wasted any time watching this podcast. But we'll have another thrilling topic next time around, so stay tuned.
Thrilling.
Yeah. Thank you, Ken. We'll talk to you next time.
All right, Tony. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.